All right, well, welcome everyone. It's great to have you all here today. Looks like people are from all over, basically Texas all the way to the East Coast. So great to see everyone here. Great to have so many people participating in this webinar. I'm really excited to have this conversation here today. I think it's a very pertinent one, very important one for us to have. Today's webinar is called The Unique Approaches to Supporting Black and Minority Male Students Through Graduation. And we're going to have it just as more of a conversational piece. I'm really excited to have Dr. Adrian Haugabrook here. He is the Executive Vice President and Managing Director of the Social Impact Collective at Southern New Hampshire University. And I've had a great chance to get to know him really well over the course of the last few years and learn from him and just get a lot of guidance and mentorship from him. So really excited to have you here with us today. Thanks for taking the time to be with us, Dr. Haugabrook.
No, excited to be here, and I appreciate the pictures that you posted up here. Not sure if we're doing sort of like a fashion show runoff or what, but we do look good. We look very good.
We do. We do. I don't have the Ted moniker behind my name though. You know, it was a smaller one. You know, called it Teddy for me. But one day I'll get to be where you are.
That's good. That's good.
So for those of you all who don't know, my name is Melvin Hines. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Upswing. Just to give you a little bit of background on what we do here at Upswing, for those of you all who don't know, we are an online student retention company. Our entire focus is on helping specifically historically marginalized students to not only succeed in college, but also to thrive in college. We were founded in Durham, North Carolina back in 2013, and we continue to provide a whole host of different wraparound student support services throughout the United States. Things that include tutoring and advising and writing support and more, as well as our virtual assistant, Anna, which a lot of our colleges work with. And today we partner with over 60 colleges and universities all across the country. And so one of the big areas that we really want to make sure that we're helping to support are our Black male students. And that's why I felt that this conversation was so poignant for us to have today. And why it was just so important to have Dr. Haugabrook here to help share a little bit of not only his own personal experiences, but also some of the things that he's seen at SNHU as well. And so that was really the first thing that I thought that we could do today is really just kind of share just different experiences that we've had, you know, kind of going through our own going to and through college journeys. I know Dr. Haugabrook, you and I are both from Georgia, you know, from South Georgia, or well, you say that you're not necessarily from South Georgia, but
we're technically middle Georgia.
Technically middle Georgia. Anyone you know who is from Atlanta would certainly say it's South Georgia. But I am for sure from South Georgia. And we both have had unique experiences that have taken us to and through college. And so I'd love for you to maybe just share kind of you know what it was like for you going to college, just some of the challenges that you remember, and just some of the things that helped you with navigating your college experience.
Sure. First, again, Melvin, thank you for the opportunity to share. And I love the fact that we're beginning this with our own experiences. And as you and I share and talk about this and do this conversation, you know, the piece that I would offer to those who are listening is to sort of extract from these experiences that we're sharing. Don't isolate them as that's Melvin's experience or that's Adrian's experience, but you know, try to understand it from the context of what potentially are some of the themes that are still kind of inherent in the student experience today. You know, I went off to college, you know, a few years ago, a few more years before Melvin did. But one of the things that I found is that some of those issues are still very salient and pervasive issues, opportunities as well as challenges. And so, thinking about that experience and those experiences, I do think that when you talk about even the title of this session about the unique approaches, the approaches are unique. And I would say to capture them in a way that really builds upon the assets of a person's experience instead of seeing things and thinking about things as deficits. So, for example, one of the things that, and I've been in the higher ed space for a number of years, we often would say, why are students leaving, or why are our Black male students leaving? That may be a truth, but what about why are our Black male students staying? How are we retaining them? How are they persisting? And so, my own personal experience is sort of a combination of those both. So you could have both and versus, or thinking of it in terms of a dichotomy. When I think of my experience, I do think of, sort of thinking about the process. What was the process like even before getting into a higher ed institution? I think about those experiences that connected me in a number of ways. So I was a student athlete coming out of high school, was recruited and played as a scholarship athlete at the University of West Georgia. So I was on the football team. And as I think about some of those experiences, it's not just being a student athlete, but I thought about some of those experiences that would make for solid programming and really thinking about the learner experience for today, particularly for Black males. So if you think about it as a football player, I had a built-in community even before I arrived on the campus. The second was I had an immersive experience with the campus and with others. So I actually had the opportunity to begin building sort of an affiliation or a network. And so thinking about those aspects of the sense of belonging. I remember getting on campus and thinking to myself, oh my gosh, this place looks huge. In actuality, it really wasn't that big, but thinking about it from your experience base, it looks huge, partly because you don't know where everything is. But being an athlete at that time, I had to be there on campus at least a month before classes began. So it gave me an opportunity to literally like onboard before the true matriculation experience and the enrollment experience. Again, thinking about that sense of community, thinking about those ties that really help you to understand where things are and what those expectations were. But then it also connected me very quickly with what we call, often, caring. At the time I was, 18, 17, those caring adults who ended up, you find out, are your professors, your advisors, others, your coaches, that are actually helping to build that social capital that you need or that you're looking for to really drive that experience moving forward. There's some other things that I could talk about a little bit later, but just thinking about that experience itself. The other thing that I'll just offer is, I know, and Melvin, you and I have talked about it before, is that you get to that campus and you begin to wonder, where and how do I fit? And the thing that I would offer for all of us that are here today to think about is, many of us are in sort of that traditional coming of age campus residential experience, but really thinking about how higher education today really is an expansion of that. It's not just place-based. And in fact, back then, or even now, we call the non-traditional student who's older, the one who works, those are actually the new traditional students and new traditional learners. And so really thinking about how do we understand the context of the learner and the learner experience as being core to all of this work. And then when you pack onto it other dimensions of that person's identity, and in this case, as we're talking about African-American males, let's be sure that obviously we're talking in generalities, but that we don't treat the experience or the identity as a monolith. Melvin and I may look alike, but Melvin and I are not the same person. We may have had similar upbringings, but we're not the same person. And so really thinking about how do you understand the context of the African-American male experience, again, in general terms, but also understanding that you can't solve issues, you can't create opportunities in a monolithic way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so glad that you shared that as an opening, because that was exactly how um, I think you really encapsulated the experience for me as well. I didn't know a whole lot about the University of Georgia when I went to Athens for undergrad. And so much so that I remember thinking, I don't even know if they're gonna have, I was a big fan of chewing gum. I was like, I don't even know if they're gonna have chewing gum there, you know, how big is Athens? And so I brought a whole box of chewing gum with me, um, my first my first year on campus. And you know, it was one of those experiences where you get there and it just feels like an entire metropolis. It is so huge
Mm,
and you feel so tiny. And the question is, where do I fit? Um, and I think that because for me personally, I really didn't want to um, you know, become, you know, I didn't want people to see that, for example, I needed help, or that I, you know, didn't understand all these new ways that were out there. To me, it was a lot of kind of the suffering and silence, if you will, during a large part of that first year,
mm,
because you know it's like I don't want, you know, these folks to think that not only do I not fit, you know, being a Black male on campus, but also being a Black male from South Georgia on campus. And you know, that didn't really even have anything to do with, you know, for example, socioeconomic status or any of those types of things. It was
right.
just the fact that what I grew up with was so much different from what that experience is. And so a big part of what, you know, we certainly have to do as we're supporting our students today is think about how we can help to not just be sympathetic, but empathetic to, you know, the newness of the experience so that we can help support them along the way. And as you mentioned, it's going to be different for each different student. But
Right.
if we assume that it's all looking a certain way, we can certainly cause many of them to fall through the cracks.
Yeah. No, that's very true. And it's again, appreciate and double click on everything that you just mentioned. You know, the other piece that I would offer to this is, you know, sometimes when we look at opportunities and challenges, for many of us, because we're tied to organizations or institutions, we look at it from an institutional approach. How can we, as an institution, solve for these challenges? My challenge to all of us would be, how do we invert that and look at what is the value proposition for the student, for the learner? And so when you think of it that way, it's less about, well, this is what we have as an institution, and we're going to extend this to Melvin. It's really understanding what Melvin as from a learner-centric perspective, and then how does Melvin fit within that ecosystem of the institution, and where are those points of tension? Where are those opportunity, where does opportunity exist? And then again, thinking about where and how do you tie that in? And so we also know that as institutions and as organizations, we look for ways to maximize efficiencies. And so in some regard, that would actually be an affront to this notion of understanding the learner experience or understanding the African-American male experience as a diverse aspect of things versus a monolithic way. So you might say, well, it just doesn't make sense. It doesn't promote efficiency. But if you truly understand the learner experience, you actually build the infrastructure to support that kind of dynamism, so that you're actually able to find those points of resonance that really help to bring the program forward. I know one of the questions that sometimes folks will ask is, well, can't you just solve for student success and then that will actually solve all the problems? um, One could say yes, but then you also, in order to have a student success model or to actually offer student success services or supports to really lift all boats, you do have to look at where are those opportunities to really drive, significant gains. At a previous institution in which I served, we too said, you know, we need to develop a student success model because as we look at the aggregate, we have a retention and persistence problem. And so we couched it as that from a strategy perspective. But then as we began to disaggregate the data to look at where are the opportunities and where are the challenges, that's where we found things such as 15% of seniors who were within graduation, ranges of graduation, were withdrawing and weren't even requesting transcripts. And what did that tell us? That told us that somehow they're dropping out of the pipeline and they're not even going anywhere else. They're not requesting to transfer someplace. We looked at retention and persistence rates by race, ethnicity, by gender, by academic program, by classification. And so when you start disaggregating the data, that's how you begin to build a student success model. So it's not just about, well, we'll just do the big and that will solve for it all. You also have to understand the different components of that and where and how that works. And then that's when you begin to see if you can solve for some of these issues in a more determined, focused way, you can also solve for the whole as well.
I like that. I like that. In fact, that's a big part of why I started Upswing in the first place was, you know, back in 2013 or before 2013, there were all these big initiatives that were happening all over the country. It seemed like, you know, you had the flipped classroom approach that was taking place, you know, up in New York, and the work that folks like Michelle Rhee was working on in DC and Sal Khan in California.
Right.
And, you know, for me, it was, well, what type of supports are there for people in Albany, Georgia, right? What are the types of supports for folks who don't live in the major cities, but are really just looking for a level of coaching and support and guidance from people who might not always be in their local neighborhoods, but who would certainly love to help if they could. That was a big part of why Upswing got started in the first place. And even as we built out tools like Anna, the virtual assistant, to help students along the way, a big part of that was that we wanted to create something that felt natural, felt personal, felt customized to each student's support and needs, and not just, say, an automated chatbot, or not just, you know, a place to just kind of get a bunch of answers, but actually someone that could help you, no matter if you are a first generation student or an online student or going back as a student parent, that you can still feel that someone actually is guiding you along that pathway. I remember I was at a conference recently, and there was another person talking about, you know, chatbots and things like that. And they were talking about, you know, what we found in our data was that, you know, certain minority groups were much more likely to use them than other groups. And someone raised a question and asked their hand, you know, asked the person why. And the person just said, you know, I don't know. And to me, it was one of those big heartbreaking moments, because it's like, I could tell you the entire experience as to why this, you know, this has worked so well, and why this is so necessary. And it goes back to exactly what you were just mentioning,
Right.
which is that when you are customizing and personalizing the experience to each individual's pathway, as opposed to creating a one-size-fits-all approach,
Right.
all of a sudden people feel seen, they feel heard, and they feel like they have the chance to grow and maybe even, you know, get that degree and going on to have further success.
Yeah, I love that experience in that story, because the other piece that I think we well, I'll put it in the positive as a sort of a positive spin on it, that some of us get right, which is that you know, we can disaggregate the data all we want, and it will tell us certain things. But there's a difference between the structured data and the unstructured data. And so the structured data will give you that very example that you just talked about, Melvin, which will say the data shows that students of color or African-American male students do not do you know, right? But what unstructured data, which is why, again, if we go back to putting the learner at the top of the pyramid versus the institution, that's when you begin to understand the experience that that learner is having. Now, it may not aggregate to, you know, a quantitative story, but hearing how students and learners are engaging with programs, with technology, with the experience of the campus or the university, with the modality, with the academic program. That's where you begin to build the narrative and the learner profiles and the personas that really help you to better understand, well, what is the data telling you, and also what is it not telling you? So what I love about Anna, and you used this before, it's customized, it's personalized, it's flexible, it's dynamic in a way, and all those things that we think about, and it's like, well, gosh, that must be pretty expensive. How do you customize or individualize for every single Black male student on our campus? The intent is to utilize technology as a tool to be able to promote that kind of programming, that kind of engagement. And then it brings back that data to better help you understand where and how you actually improve services. So when I think of technology, often people think of technology as, hardware, software, the laptop, the tools that we're using to actually do this webinar. But technology is really about systems, processes, products. And so it could be the very tools that we're using right now. And so what I actually like using the term digital enablement as opposed to technology, because of what technology conjures in people's minds. But when you think about digital enablement, that's what Anna is doing. When you think of digital enablement and you think about what even this platform that we're using for this webinar, through some digital capability, it's enabling us to share stories. It's enabling us to share out information or knowledge. Anna is enabling Adrian as a learner, as a student at Houston Community College, to be able to have my sense of agency and ownership for my academic direction, or a sense of agency to engage with an advisor in a way that is going to help drive my progression, my progress on campus. And so really thinking about that kind of enablement as a tool to help with that kind of customization. So customization and individualization doesn't mean all things for all people. What it does is it allows you as the learner or the student to actually be able to author the pathway that you're looking for, creating that sense of agency. Anna's not doing that work. Anna is enabling that work.
Yeah, absolutely. And you actually already started to answer the next the next question I was going to ask you, because I really wanted us to be able to juxtapose what people typically tend to see, right? Such as statistics around there being this declining enrollment of men in higher education versus women, right? The fact that Black men, for example, represent just 4.6% of those enrolled in all of college, and that Black men are 10% less likely to graduate than Black females, with what's also happening simultaneously, right? That even as enrollment overall has been decreasing, suddenly we've started seeing this huge influx in HBCU enrollment all across the country, right? An increase 57% nationally. We're starting to see, many of those levels of support taking place with, some of our partner schools, for example, like NCA&T, we've seen huge growth there, Winston-Salem State, schools like that. And my question to you is, how do you juxtapose those two things happening, and how do we make sure that what we're finding is working well is being replicated across all institutions, not necessarily just, for example, HBCUs?
Right. When you look at these data here, again, these are data that are in the aggregate. And again, nothing wrong with this, because what this is telling us is these are signals and trends. Well, of course, the slide says enrollment trends. These are signals and trends that are telling us directionally where things may be going. But when we draw down, so we could use these as benchmarks, but when we draw down to the institutional levels, this is where you begin to see not only where does the institution sit within these national trends, but it also begins to help you understand, well, what are the things that we're doing that are actually that we're doing very well? And then where and how do we take those data and say, are these replicable practices or systems, policies, or tools that we have that actually can help drive those enrollments or drive success? One of the things that we're seeing, particularly with HBCU enrollments, and both of my children graduated from HBCUs. Our son just graduated from Morehouse College last spring of 22, and our daughter graduated from Spelman in spring of 20. And this is the anecdote, right? This is a sum of two, but their rationale for going to HBCUs was, again, for some of the very reasons that you will not find in the unstructured data. It's the lived experiences. It's the place. I remember going to visit my daughter, a couple of months after she had started her classes at Spelman. And I flew into town. I met her in the cafeteria at Spelman. Do you know that almost every single cafeteria worker knew who she was, came up and introduced themselves to me, and they say, "We're going to take care of your daughter."
Wow.
Right? That's not going to show up in institutional data sets. Okay. So I offer that as a way for us to understand, again, putting the learner first and understanding the learner experience. And what we say is, what is the job that they want to have done? For some, it's, I'm going to college because I want that next best job. I want because I'm at a juncture in my career or in my lifespan where I need to have something pivotal that's actually going to move my mobility. What is the job to be done? And then as we began thinking about the work that's happening at institutions, how do you take those learner personas or even those learner profiles and build around that? The thing that is also interesting that you don't see in these data points, and again, this is not to say that this is incorrect, but looking at the number of learners, and particularly students of color and African-American male students, who are looking for greater flexibility in their higher education options, looking for different types of credentials and degree opportunities, looking for more sort of short-term, shorter learning format types of credentials that allow them to be able to manage and support the flexibility that they need in their life cycles. And you don't necessarily see that in here, but you also begin to understand that there are demand signals that we're now beginning to see relative to that. And so, when I talk about flexibility, that flexibility is in terms of both the flexibility associated with being able to take courses at different times, but also flexibility in the modalities in which they're taking courses. One of the things that the pandemic sort of accelerated was this notion that there are learners across the spectrum, including our African-American male students, who are have been asking for, and now have access to digital and online opportunities for learning. Supports the flexibility. We're at SNHU, we're seeing increases in the number of students and learners of color who are moving into the space. We're even seeing an uptick in the number of the traditional 18 to 22-year-olds who are actually now coming into fully online environments. And so I think that's a bit of what these trend data will share with you. It's what you see, but it's also what you don't see. It's the structured data, but it's also the unstructured.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I had a conversation somewhat recently with one of my colleagues in HBCU. I'll leave out the name, but they're saying, prior to the pandemic, we saw our competition, right? Because inevitably you think of it as competition. We saw our competition as being the other local HBCUs, that other students could compete with, right? And he said, what we learned through the pandemic was that our competition is actually schools like well, your school, Southern New Hampshire, Western Governors, Arizona State. And the idea here, right, is that because there is this shifting tide in terms of demand for flexibility, for online supports, for the ability to continue your collegiate education, even if you have a bump in the road that prevents you from being able to be on campus. That rising tide in demand has caused people to start to look at and seek, those opportunities within the colleges that they attend. And so we are starting to see many of those changes take place amongst the colleges that we're seeing, and that really just means that this need to create more of that flexibility on campus is moving from, say, a nice to have pre-pandemic to certainly more of a need to have now.
Yeah, absolutely true. And then, as educators and, thinking about, there may be questions out there about like, how do I, as an educator, understand the experience of, particularly as we're talking about Black males, without, treating it as a monolith. And I think it goes back again to the point that I made before about really understanding, the learner experience and hearing that narrative and hearing that voice. But then also, as institutions can support educators, their staff and others, by really understanding and like sharing out these learner personas and learner profiles. And what that then does is it helps to not see every Black male as the same. And so I think that's a pretty exceptional way of thinking about that experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to give a call out to just a couple of our partners that I knew, some of the things that they were doing on their campuses. So here are just a few that I know we've seen just since working with some of these, all across the spectrum: HBCUs, HSIs, community colleges, 4-year universities. But in particular, I know that Durham Tech recently established their Men of Color Scholars Institute just a few years ago, actually. But I know that even before then, they were really pushing a minority male mentoring initiative, with the goal being that they wanted to create that same level of community that we were talking about earlier on, feeling maybe a bit wanting in our first year on college campuses. That's something that they've really been trying to spearhead a pretty good bit. I know Winston-Salem State, for example, also took a look at ways in which they wanted to work to improve persistence in Black males, and found that some of the initiatives that were going on through their platform helped to increase persistence there. The Houston Community College system, a study that they conducted that found specifically the impact of providing more flexible tutoring options can provide that support. And I think we actually have a slide on that here that just tends to highlight that when you're providing a flexible tutoring model, it actually takes, for each individual interaction and session that students have, can actually change that GPA in very, very concrete ways here. And this study was actually conducted, I think, by Rice University, of Houston Community College students. You can certainly see that benefit takes place across different swaths of data that you're cutting it there. So certainly lots of really just exciting and interesting initiatives that have been taking place among many of our college partners that we have today. I'd certainly love to hear just any, the types of initiatives that you all have looked at implementing as well at Southern New Hampshire, or if you have any guidance on just sort of some of the things that you've seen here with these initiatives as well.
Yeah. I want to go to a question or a thought as a lead into the response to that, Melvin, which is, so I spoke about digital enablement, and again, thinking about technology is not just the hardware and the software. So, a question might be, well, how do we ensure that we're not creating inequities because of the use of technology? And so a couple of things that I would say. One is, you don't buy the technology and then try to find a problem for it to solve, right?
Right.
So first,
Right.
ensure that you've identified what the real problem is, and then identify what is a solution to that problem. So that's one. I think the second is, again, expanding that definition of technology to understand that it's not just about the hardware and the software, and that it is about processes and systems and other things. So a bit to your question that you just asked that also relates to this is, if you think about where points of tension are or friction are within the institution, you might actually find that you are creating barriers to Black males or to other learners because of a process that you have in place, right? Or that you've implemented some digital tool or technology tool with the expectation that everyone can use it, and you're not actually providing literacy training, onboarding, or other kinds of activities to ensure that people actually know how to utilize that tool as a resource. And so thinking about it in that term, and then getting to this question of, so what are some of the things that we have done? I would say we, as in Southern New Hampshire, and then we, the collective of what I've seen other institutions that are doing, is, one is thinking about it as a strategic imperative, a strategic priority. So student success, yes, you can strategize around that. But if you're not clearly identifying who and where those opportunities to improve and enhance the student experience, the student success and progression, then you're missing a big part of it. So really declaring and communicating this as a strategic imperative. The second thing that I've seen and that we're doing, and I've seen in other places, is that you may look at it as a student success strategy, but you also have to look at it as a people strategy. Sometimes sometimes the barriers to student success is that you're doing all this work to improve the student experience, but you're not building the capabilities and the competencies in those within the institution or the organization. And so we have a very defined student strategy as well as a people employee strategy. If you're not, if those aren't crosswalking, then you can put all your investment in one place and never see the actual return on that investment. And I'm not talking about in terms of tuition dollars. I'm talking about in terms of the student experience and the learner experience. The other piece to this is, many of us, all of us, I am going to assume, all of us have a diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy. We should, if we don't. We all have, but we also have to understand that the nomenclature and the definitions within that, those are three different things that in harmony actually drive progress and growth. Diversity is the representational aspect of diversity. The equity is, what are the things that you're doing to mitigate disparities within the institution or within the student experience or learner experience? And then inclusion is that sense of belonging, that sense of agency that we talked about earlier. And so if you're looking at it in that way, that's when you begin to see where and how institutional change, how strategy and other kinds of things can be directed to really drive, be it Black male success, student of color success, all student success, but it really begins to help drive those goals there.
Absolutely, absolutely. It really conjures up two examples that I wanted to share that we've just seen from the Upswing side of things. One, that was something we've tended to see with our campuses, so we tried to share the data. It's not actually on here, but I think it was actually in our most recent webinar for anyone who's interested in seeing that. We basically took a look at all the times that just any kind of tutoring or academic sessions are requested. All the data that we have on that, and we basically create this chart that shows when those requests are for every hour of the week. And then we overlaid that with the average time that, say, a learning center is open, for example, across campuses. And what you tend to see is that the need and demand for the tutoring support is only 33% within those hours that the Learning Center is open. 2/3 of all the session requests, the needs, are taking place outside of that time frame. And I think we found that something like 20% of that need actually happens on Saturdays and Sundays. So this is one of those things where we might measure the input being very significant, right? Oh, we're doing a lot of things to help support student success, but we're not actually looking at the outcomes, right?
Right.
How is it impacting those who are maybe needing the most flexibility or most on the fringe there?
Right.
And there was a second example that we actually found out internally for ourselves. So same thing, we're taking a look at the tutoring aspect. Sorry, I don't have a slide for everyone on this, but I remember this taking place. We've got hundreds of tutors that provide support in hundreds of subjects for online tutoring. And we thought for years, we're doing a great job, right? Like, we've got these tutors, we've got the demand for the tutors, all this sort of stuff. And then it took one person's conversation to say, how do we know that people aren't going in searching for something and not finding what they need? So it led to us doing basically this thing called key logging, where essentially you can see every letter that a person types and when they erase it because they don't see the subject that they're looking for. Sure. And that led us to finding out that there was, an increased demand in nursing. There was an increased demand in so many subjects that we didn't realize we didn't have as tutors, and allowed us to, as a tutoring part of our organization, to go back and actually create, supplies of those tutors that the students needed.
Right.
In both of those circumstances, you kind of have a bit of a bias on what your input is, as opposed to really kind of seeing, how are the students who need the help the most being, impacted, and how can we make sure that we're supporting that? And by, kind of having that lens, you can really start to change the things that the resources that you're putting in place to make sure that those students are being supported.
Yeah. No, I think that is a beautiful representation of how you actually discern the story behind the data. It goes back to the point before about, are students actually asking for greater flexibility? So again, we may time it as, the service is available from 8 to 4, but when you look at the data, it's saying Saturdays, Sundays, and 8 to 10 p.m. Right. Right. And so again, thinking about what does that mean, and how do you really service in that perspective? There was one more point that I wanted to make relative to the piece about how are you bridging and building, someone had called it digital literacy. And that has to be an inherent part of the programming that you do. It's just like, you don't put, someone in a car for the first time behind the driver's side and say, okay, drive the car. Right. There's got to be coaching and support that actually helps to drive that. So again, I think those are the data points that you're talking about that really help to inform the experience. And when you look at these data here, it's telling us something. And so there's one thing to collect the data, but how are we analyzing those data as well? What inferences can we make from it? And is it the right data? And so as we think about from an institutional perspective, we can dashboard the heck out of something, right? But if I'm looking at a dashboard and it's not really telling me, or I can't discern what it's actually telling me, it may be great data, but it may not be the kind of data that actually informs the experience. And again, data is also there to actually help you ask more questions than you actually get answers for.
And continue to challenge yourself, if, don't think that you're at the mountaintop, think that you're at the plateau, right? If we've resolved for this one issue, let's figure out what other issues might be there. Because we never know who's the next segment or section or, subgroup of student parents or adult learners, or, we don't even know what 5 years from now has for us. And we want to make sure that we're just constantly being supportive of the next realm where what we're doing today might not be as supportive 5 years from now as it was today. So absolutely agree with you on those points for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, and you said 5 years. I'm not even sure 2 years is a to be honest. But the piece that I would say, Melvin, and I think about this stuff a lot. In fact, I was just in an all-day strategy meeting yesterday around something very similar. And it's one thing to have the supportive services and programs available for students and learners. Is it reliable and sustainable? One of the worst things that you can do is to put something, now, this doesn't mean that you can't experiment, completely understand. But you can't keep adding something and taking something away and then expect to see some level of improvement. Right. And then also there's another thing that I've said for a long time, just because you offer it, it could actually be detrimental to learners. You think it's helpful, but it actually may do a disservice to learners in the learner experience. And so you really have to have those very reliable, consistent ways of validating the efficacy of the work that's being done, ensuring the sustainability and reliability of it, and that also that the experience of the learner mirrors the data that you see relative to the progress of the learner.
That's a really good point for us to end on. I really appreciate you taking the time here, Dr. Haugabrook, to just walk through so many of these different experiences that you've had, as well as the experiences that other students have here as well, and ways in which we can bridge that gap and just continue to grow, particularly with our Black males, but with all males as well, all students as well. I wanted to, in the last few minutes that we have here, allow for people to ask any questions that they might have as well of you while we have you here. So I'm going to kick it over to Simone to see if there were any questions that people in the audience might have that we can ask of Dr. Haugabrook while we have him.
Would you please share your thoughts on mandatory versus volunteer attendance at tutoring or intervention services?
Ooh. So that's I don't want to sound evasive, but that's a great question. I think the way I would answer it is more about, again, centered around the learner. What would be the reason for the mandatory tutoring or interventions? I know that there's what I call the vulnerable stages of enrollment that many of our students and learners will go through. And there is a way that you can mandate it. So again, if you're thinking about very traditional, residential coming of age experiences for our learners, there could be a way that you do that because the institutional dynamics and culture of the institution dictates that. So if I see that Simone and Melvin have to go, then the expectation is that I go. So there's a way of thinking about that. But I also think that the word that I'm getting hung up on is the sessions, because to me, in my mind, when I think of sessions, it means that, okay, you're scheduled for an 8 o'clock here, this, that, and the other. And I think this is where some innovative ways of thinking, doing, and acting could come to play. So again, as an example, digital enablement. So Anna, as an example, is there a way that you provide support programs and services that are more nudged than it is about compulsory or mandatory? What are the kinds of things that help me to understand as a student at your institution or as a Black male in the context of this work, that it helps me to develop that sense of agency and advocacy that I can actually raise my hand to be able to say, you know what, I think this might be a point for me to actually ask for help. And there could be a way of synergizing both of those so that you actually have that as a requirement, for some period of time. And then it's married with my ability to be able to raise my hand. One of the institutions in which I served, we built in a mandatory set of requirements for first-year students to be able to meet with their advisors and do, the kinds of things that were necessary. The way that we did that was we incentivized them because that there was credit that was associated with it. But what we saw was after that period of time, it was a short period of time. After that period of time, almost all of our students, regardless of gender, race, ethnicity, continued on with their advising format all the way up to and through their juniors and senior years. And so, I do think that there's some ways that you can shape culture and shape the learner experience so that it doesn't feel like it is a penalty to raise my hand, but they actually see it as a part of their progress and success.
I like that. And you pretty much have said it perfectly. The only thing I was going to add was that we've seen the same thing happen with our colleges that have, for example, a freshman, seminar series.
Right.
And a lot of times they'll do exactly what you said. Hey, I want you to learn how to get in contact with your advisor, how to schedule a session via Upswing, those types of things. And usually after you've done that, they've decreased the barrier, right? They've gotten over the fear or the trepidation of how do I navigate this molehill. And now all of a sudden they can, when they actually need that help and support, they can actually navigate that. So I'd agree with that as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
We have another question here. We have an attendee who works at a PWI where Black male faculty and staff or graduate students are limited. Most times they're too busy to help with the mentorship of their Black male students, and all of her staff is all female. So do you have any suggestions on how to meet the needs of these students, especially when they've expressed they want mentorship?
Yeah, I have some thoughts. Since I went first, Melvin, before I'll let you go first. I have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's an interesting perspective. I can, again, as Dr. Haugabrook has been saying over this course of time, I'm just an N of one, but what I would say is that certainly mimics my experience at the University of Georgia, where there were limited Black male faculty. I think that for me, while it certainly is important and very much helpful to be able to have ways to connect with people who look like me and who've had those same experiences as I've had, I think it's sometimes just as important to have mentors who come from other experiences who can help you to bridge some of those things that are new and unique to you. I still fondly think about a couple of the mentors that I had at the University of Georgia who helped me with just how to give a public presentation, right? How to be in these leadership circles where, this person, again, this Black male from South Georgia is now giving this presentation in Atlanta, for example, on behalf of the University of Georgia. Those experiences I received weren't always from people that were Black males. And so to me, it's about getting, maybe more of the campus involved in mentoring people and creating that community so that it doesn't necessarily always have to fall on people who look like those students. They can certainly provide a level of support, but I think that everyone else kind of creating that village approach can certainly provide a level of support as well. So that's kind of what my experience was at the University of Georgia, but would certainly love to hear yours as well.
I would, again, almost double click exactly on what you were saying, Melvin, and even more specifically, thinking, and since the question came from someone who's at a PWI, a predominantly white institution, one is to expand the network and the affiliation. And again, it's not just saying, hey, would you help serve as mentors for our men of color, but also providing the training and the development. So one of the things that we've done at SNHU, and we're a large institution. I mean, large, almost 200,000 students. We also have a traditional residential campus. We have 13,000 employees all across the country. I mean, just huge. But so don't be in awe of that. Be in awe of the fact that we still realize that even though our learners, most of our learners and students are online, that we know the experience of the learner. And so we have built employee resource groups, communities of practice. There's one community of practice, and I'm not going to remember the exact title of the community of practice, but it's white males who are wanting to be allies. And so through some of these training and development opportunities, you're actually developing mentorship opportunities and capabilities. I think the other piece to this too is that much like Melvin, my experience at a PWI was that I was able to network through the institution, not all by myself, so please don't take it that way. But I had access, like my head coach at the time, Frank Bohan, was one of the strongest mentors that I had in all 4 years that I was at the institution. And then I had faculty members who were African-American or white or other race and ethnicities who actually saw it as part of their responsibility and capability to actually help build that sense of investment in learners, and particularly learners of color. I know, Melvin, one of the questions that you had talked about asking was, about, the roles of fraternities and sororities.
Yeah.
I had a sociology professor in my second quarter. We were on a quarter system at the time, when I was pledging my fraternity, Kappa Alpha Psi, who was a professor. He was a member of Kappa. He made me sit in the very front of the class, but it was because he was teaching me the skills and requisite behaviors to understand how to be successful in a college environment. And so there are all these things that could be through training and development in other areas, but then also, again, that's why understanding the formal and informal networks that are built through these experiences. The last thing that I'll say is that we often look for, I know this isn't always the case, so just hear what I'm saying. We sometimes look for people with the titles to actually be the mentors or to be the thought leaders or the folks.
Right.
I've always said, listen to the folks who are closest to the student. They have a better sense of what the problems, the points of tension, friction are, what opportunities there may be, and what signals and trends, just because they are that close to the learner. So, so you got to listen to those folks and invite them in to provide that mentorship, that sponsorship in that work, coaching as well.
How do we encourage our Black male students to take advantage of access and accommodation services when it's noticeably needed? How do we get rid of the negative stigma of disability services? So it's a two-part question there.
Ooh, wow.
Yeah,
so
I'll let you go first this time.
Yeah. And thanks for that question. I see it's from Fort Valley State. Fort Valley is right around the corner from Warner Robins, so know Fort Valley well. I would say, and I think someone said it in the chat earlier, the earlier that you can normalize those services and those relationships, the better it becomes. Understanding, and again, there are ways that you can, quote, destigmatize that, the use of these services. The other thing relative to the mental health services and wellness, there's a lot that's happening in terms of the national discourse. Discourse is happening at the institutional levels around access to wellness. And so I think, the communication and other kinds of tools that are needed to really help drive and shift behaviors. One of the strategies that I used to use when I was, earlier in my career was, if I could find that one cool person that would say, hey, I went to the advising center, the ripple effect of that was
right.
was so strong. Now, you may not be able to do that for the entire campus, but I do think it's the, putting the right people and the right resources in place at the right time.
Yeah, and I would just add on top of that, one of the things that we learned to do with Anna in particular was recognizing that so the question with everything that that we do with Upswing is, how do we decrease the barrier to the first time, right?
Right.
So make it so you don't have to download something, make it et cetera, et cetera. With regards to this particular question here, that's what we wanted to get at. How do we encourage more students to request, for example, mental health and wellness resources, or to get destigmatized for maybe certain types of needs that they have. The way that we really tried to go about that was making Anna feel personalized enough that Anna is constantly approaching the student to ask, hey, can I help you with this, right? Can I help you with X? This is the time of the year that many students are struggling with Y. Is this something I can help you with? The more that they keep hearing that from Anna in particular, the easier it is for the student to then raise their hand and say, yeah, that's actually me. And when they make that little hand raise, that makes it easier for us to then quickly point them to the right resource before they change their mind. So to me, even without Anna, that's how I would suggest going about it is, it's not just a one-time question that you ask everybody. You kind of keep, checking in, keep checking in, and eventually they start to open up and start to share some of those needs. And when they begin to realize that it actually wasn't that big of a deal, that we were able to actually provide them with that level of support, then all of a sudden you're starting to see them ask for the next thing that they needed help with, and the next thing, and maybe even tell other people. And so then they become that cool student that Dr. Haugabrook was talking about, right? So that would be another suggestion that I would have there as well.
Great. So we're a little bit past the hour, but I think we have time for this final question. What are your thoughts of a first-year college entry-level course that has an appeal or theme for Black and minority males?
My short answer to that would be yes. So it's the appeal, it's content, again, thinking about the modality, thinking about the flexibility, thinking about the learner experience. I absolutely, and some of the things that we're talking about in terms of how do you begin to cultivate that sense of agency early enough? How do you normalize the relationships and partnerships? Someone could argue otherwise, but I would say, why not? And for some places, it's definitely worth the experimentation or the innovation to see and find out what you learn.
Yeah, I would say yes as well. I haven't mentioned this, but this is actually part of how I got into this space in the first place, was that while I was finishing up my grad school, I got approached by the dean of North Carolina Central at the time, who said, hey, we're trying to do this first year student success program. We want to really increase the first year to second year retention rates, and we want to invite adjunct professors to teach these courses on Fridays. And so I said I'd love to participate. Did that for 3 years, and what I noticed over that course of time was that those students were coming up and asking different questions about how did I decide what career path I wanted to choose, and just so many different questions that were outside of what I was even talking about in that class. That I began to realize that, man, we need to create this mentorship model, and that's how the early kind of first fruits of Upswing began. So I think that it certainly is really needed, and that it could be a huge benefit for students everywhere. So it sounds like we're at the end of time here, but I want to thank everyone for your time today. So many really good questions, so much engagement and participation, and I for sure want to thank Dr. Haugabrook for taking time out of your busy schedule, flying all over the world to stop for an hour and have this conversation here today. That's just so vital and so important. So thank you so much for your time today.
No, I thank you. And I want to share my appreciation to you, Melvin, for having the idea to turn your experience into something that actually would have benefit to a lot more people. And so the magnification, amplification of that is inherent in the work that you're doing. And I hope that that everyone that was able to hear this can actually be amplifiers even more. And so again, this was our conversation, and truly appreciate that everyone that's here had the opportunity to be a part of that conversation. So I thank you.
Thank you. Absolutely. And for everyone, I know I think there was a question that was here about this. The recording will be sent out afterwards so that people can pass this along and hopefully help to amplify it even more. If you do have any questions about anything that we've talked about today or any other things around Upswing in particular, feel free to reach out to us at info@upswing.io. And other than that, we just thank you all for your time and look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Take care, everyone.
Thank you all.